Hey everybody, what is going on? HexLex here with another Master Duel video for you guys today. In this one, we are going to be taking yet another look at one of our metagame analyses as we come towards the end of Season 6 here. I don't know yet if this is going up on the last day of the season, but if not the last day, it'll be like one of the last days. But yeah, it's been a little bit since we've done one of these. I wanted to wait until the meta had gotten fleshed out a little bit more. It looks like that is now the case. I went to check Master Duel meta. I usually like to check it once, at least like every other day or so, just to look for like trends and updates. And yeah, as I went to check it today being the 22nd at the time that I'm recording this, yeah, we saw a pretty significant change. Actually, I think it'd been a few days since last I looked at it, because last time I looked at it, I remember Soul Tenyi had just barely passed Trizu, but now it is definitely quite a bit of a power level gap between them. As Soul Tenyi we're seeing at 18.7, Trizu we're seeing at 10.5. Now, as always, we do need to be mindful that this tier list is a snapshot of the meta using data from, as we can see, DMC and community tournaments. So this is a tournament tier list. This is not necessarily representative of the ranked ladder. However, a lot of these decks that we're seeing on this tier list we're also going to see on ranked ladder anyway. So it's definitely still not a bad idea to talk about them. Besides, these metagame analysis are less about looking at this tier list itself and more about just looking at the individual deck breakdowns, looking at the trends within them, and then just piecing together what it all means, more or less. So when we look at this tier list right here, right, it's pretty easy to think like, oh no, Trizu's, you know, gone now. It's no longer tier 1. It's actually, for the first time, I think, since, you know, Master Duel became a thing, just very outclassed. I know there was one point where, like, Drytron briefly passed Trizu as the best deck, but that was only for a little bit and only by, like, a point or two. You know, 18.7, 10.5 is definitely a much more significant margin, but it is also still the result we expected to see, right? Because Soul Tenyi is definitely just, not only the better matchup when the decks are facing against one another, but tends to just be overall a slightly more powerful deck in general. Just because it's inboard, it's got a lot of the same consistency that Trizu does. It doesn't have one card combos like it doesn't have one card combos like Trizu does, but Soul Tenyi does still have very, very consistent combos, and as a result, you know, is just able to, and not only they have the, you know, almost as consistent combos, but they put out stronger end boards. That's kind of one of the main things that they can do. Not that Revolt is a bad end board, but, you know, it's not as good as like Chi Shao plus Baron plus Protos plus a Blackout, sometimes Slash plus a Chow Fang. Swordsoul Tenyi just has so many different like end boards it can land on, and so many powerful options for those aforementioned end boards that it's kind of no surprise. And again, just also the fact that it's got a pretty good matchup against Trizu. It's generally no surprise that Soul Tenyi is pretty handily beating out Trizu. Again, that's not to say that Trizu is now a bad or, like, you know, unplayable deck by any means. Again, this being a tournament tier list, I would still put Trizu at tier 1 alongside Swordsoul Tenyi. I do think Swordsoul Tenyi is above Trizu within tier 1, but I think Trizu is still tier 1. Similarly, I would put these Eldlich variants as well as Virtual World in tier 2, probably alongside Sky Striker. And maybe you could argue a couple of other decks, like maybe Phantom Knights. I know I was all not adamant, but like I know in a couple of you know, meta game analysis ago, I was like, oh, I'm pretty sure Phantom Knights are just like a good, and I think Phantom Knights are still a pretty solid like lower tier 2, upper tier 3 deck. But given that they're not seeing the appropriate amount of representation to become tier 2, I think we just have to call them a tier 3 deck at this point. Same with like Prank Kids. Adamantipator I still think is in terms of its power level, a tier 3 deck. In terms of its representation, it's like a rogue deck, because like nobody's playing it anymore. But I do still think it's a fine deck overall. So, and let's see. I mean, just a whole bunch of relevant decks like IDS. IDS might be tier 2. It's definitely tier 3 if not, but it might be tier 2. That being Invoked Dogmatica Shaddoll, by the way, or any just Shaddoll variant. What else is there? Danger Kaiju. I think that's probably a tier 3 deck. I could just pop over to the Discord here. What else do they have listed that I haven't talked about? Oh, Prank Kids are definitely a tier 3 deck. Adagnister is listed as a rogue deck here. I think that could be a tier 3 deck as well, though. But yeah, so we're going to go through just a few of the deck breakdowns, because this format, again, what is, as far as like the quantity of tier 1 and 2 decks, which tends to be a little bit more of what I focus on in these metagame analysis videos, right, are the tier 1 and tier 2 decks. In terms of like quantity, like in variety, there's not quite as many as normal. But we still have a lot of the breakdowns to go through, and we're going to take a look at those trends and kind of just see how the meta is going to develop going into the beginning of Season 7 here, coming up real soon. So let us start by popping over to Soul Tenyi here, the deck breakdown. So we're looking at the main deck here. There's really not a whole lot represented here that hasn't been represented here before, which kind of just goes to show. So you might see that and think like, oh, well, then there's no new information to glean, right? Soul Tenyi is just still the same old Soul Tenyi. And it's like, yes and no. Yes, in that, I mean, at a face level, like, yeah, there's no new cards being added. So in that regard, there's no like new information, again, in that regard. But that doesn't mean there's no new information in general. Because what this tells us is that not only is Soul Tenyi more or less optimized for its current build, it's more or less optimized for the format as well. And again, that's pretty obvious by the deck's power level, not only as represented here on Master Duel meta, but just, you know, in general. The deck is very single-handedly, not single-handedly, but very handily determining kind of how the rest of the meta reacts just by sheer virtue of existing. And it should be no surprise either, because as I mentioned before, you know, Soul Tenyi is just such a powerful deck. It's got such consistent combos. Almost any two like Swordsoul and or Worm cards are enough to just let you go off, or like even at the very worst, just still making a Baron or like a level 8 synchro is still really good. Not really good, but is usually still a fairly good opening. So like even at its worst, I think this deck still tends to be fine in terms of like playing through stuff. We do see a few trends here, but I don't think they're very major ones. Like this downward trend in Yazi, but it's still at 96%. Like I very much consider Yazi a required card for the deck. I mean, it's needed for the Halcoroid line. It's just a good card in general. So, yeah, I'm not really sure what that downward trend is about, especially if it's still seeing such a high percentage here. We're seeing some upward trends here, particularly for Vessel. I imagine that's as more people are, you know, warming up to the Hulk. I mean, maybe it's just drawing from my own personal experience, but yeah, Halcoroid Online is used, looks like a pretty solid 85% of builds. So I think people were realizing that Vessel is like super good in particularly those builds, and we're starting to see some more. I definitely agree with the notion of 2 copies, and that being the most prevalent. I started off with 3 in my first build, which is, I wasn't even running Halcoroid, but even if you are running Halcoroid, 3 is, I think, way too much. This card can definitely be really bricky sometimes, because it's really good with any Tenyi monster, but if you don't have a Tenyi monster, it's really not good. Okay, looks like Protos. Let me take a sip of water here, one sec. Alright, so it looks like Protos is seeing a slight increase in play. Although I think it is very slight, because I thought last time I looked it was still seeing play in 80% of decks, and well, now it's 83%, which is still fairly comparable and makes sense to me. I imagine too the like 15% of decks that aren't playing Halcoroid or Protos are either stubborn people like I used to be, or they're probably playing some like DPE variant. I could definitely see that being the case. That said, though, I feel like you would still want to play Protos in a DPE variant. I don't know. I haven't played many DPE variants of Swordsoul Tenyi in particular. When I say DPE variant, I'm not just talking about pure Swordsoul, which I think pretty much always plays DPE, but particularly Swordsoul Tenyi, because sometimes the Swordsoul Tenyi deck does also play DPE, although I think at that point you're definitely trying to cram too many engines, like, you know, it's like too many cooks. But it's like, yeah, you know, too many cooks will spoil the broth, and if you try to jam in too many engines, then, you know, you're ultimately just going to end up kind of floundering. So, Yeah, and I definitely think Halcororodon and Protoss are way better than the DPE engine for this deck if you're having trouble deciding. Now, I also get that that's like 3 extra ultra rares, so if you already have DPE crafted for another deck and you don't want to spend the resources to craft 3 more ultra rares, then yeah, you can just probably slot in DPE. Just know that you are missing out on some, again, while not required, and that's kind of what I always said before, is like, oh, well, you don't need to play Protoss Halcororodon. Yeah, you don't, but they're still really, really good, and they open up a lot of plays that you wouldn't normally have access to, so I would generally still pretty highly recommend those cards. Imperm looks like that's seeing an upward trend in play as well, although that's also not surprising. It looks like about 85% of decks are playing some out of copies of Imperm. Yeah, I'm playing the one, which looks like 41% of people are, just because I don't really have room for more than one, and I also like to be playing Valor, which looks like seeing even more play. Well, it's interesting, right, because Valor sees more play as a one-of, but in general, overall sees less play. But that makes sense, because if people aren't playing Valor, they're probably just playing additional Imperm. I definitely think it's way better to have one Valor and one Imperm, as opposed to just 2 Imperm. Valor has multiple functions in this deck, one being a level 1 tuner, can be used for synchro plays, or just being a tuner in general can be used for Hulk. And, 2 is obviously negating monster effects, but 3 is good old Crossout Exterminator, or Crossout Designator. I always want to say Crossout Exterminator, but no, that's no one of Crossout and no one of Extermination is what I'm thinking of. But Crossout Designator, because, some decks naturally play Valor as opposed to just cramming it in like we are for Designator, like Numeron, like Sky Striker, a lot of those going second decks that play a lot of hand traps. Excuse me. Tend to play Valors, so just having that option to hit Valor, and because those onboard negation effects like Valor and Imperm are so devastating, it's important to have the Valor if you're playing crossouts, which, as we can see here, about 80% of builds are. Either playing 2 or 3 copies. Well, 75% of builds are playing 2 or 3 copies. About 4 or 5% are playing 1, and then the remaining 20% don't play any, which definitely is a little bit baffling to me. I don't know how you could get away without playing Crossout Designator in this deck, because I think it's very, very important. I'm glad to see this 80%, or this 79%, pretty much 80% Nibiru's in the deck, because that's another card where I'm like, looking at people like, how do you get away without playing this card? Not just in Swordsoul Tenyi, but in general. Whenever I see a list that doesn't have Valor and then has 3 max C, I'm just kind of like, I just have that reaction of like, what are you doing here? Not to say it's always bad, or like it's even bad in general, but I tend to think if you're playing 3 max C, you should be playing a Nibiru. Plus, obviously, again, Nibiru, a very, very good Crossout Designator target as well. Yeah, I mean, everything else is looking pretty standard here. Nothing really too special to say about these options. We're still seeing like the same percentages for pretty much everything else in the extra deck. Yeah, we're seeing the Halcororodon engine being by far the most popular one in the recent decks here. So, okay. Yep, I think that's about all we've got to cover with Swordsoul Tenyi. Let's move on to Trizu, which, if we take a look here, we see quite a few trends here, actually, that I'm noticing. Let's start with the extra deck, actually. So, I'm noticing... First thing I'm noticing here is an upward trend in Appaloosa, a downward trend of Race Vulgar. I think that's particularly telling as far as, like, DPE slots go. Or rather, that didn't make much sense the way I phrased that. I think that's particularly telling as far as, like, what cards end up getting dropped for DPE and for Anaconda. You know, at first I was like, well, let's just drop Appaloosa for Race Vulgar, because, you know, all the combos that would go into Appaloosa now just go into DPE. But I think more people are starting to include Appaloosa because they're starting to recognize that Appaloosa is really, really good against Swordsoul Tenyi. And if you're playing against specifically Swordsoul Tenyi, and you know you are, it's almost always better to go into Appaloosa than DPE, because the multiple monster effect negates are going to do a lot more against that deck than the one destruction typically does. But again, that's also like kind of more applicable to tournament formats. I guess it's still kind of applicable to best of one as well. If you hover over your opponent's deck and you see they're playing over 40 cards, It's generally safe to assume they're probably playing Sword-Souls, unless they're playing like 60 cards. Then obviously they're playing like an IDS or some 60 card deck. But I'm talking if your opponent's got anywhere from like 41 to like 46, maybe even up to 48 cards. If you see a number, like a weird number that's a little bit above 40, it's probably a Swordsoul deck. So that is one way that you can try to guess going first if your opponent's playing Sword-Souls or not. Obviously, the hand traps they play may or may not be indicative as to whether or not they're playing Sword-Souls, but generally speaking, the Appaloosa does tend to be better going first than DPE against specifically Sword-Souls. In a vacuum, I think DPE is probably still better to open. Just because it's a little less susceptible to removal, which Appaloosa is very susceptible to. But then Swordsoul doesn't play like Lightning Storm or Ageki or anything like that typically, so that's another reason why Appaloosa tends to be better against Soul Tenyi than something like DPE. We're also seeing upward trends of play of both Chakanine and Tiger Mortar. The Tiger Mortar in particular is interesting, especially given that it sees played about 30% of decks, and then we're seeing the DPE engine played in like about 75% of decks. So what that tells me is that there's likely about a 5% overlap of decks that are playing both Tiger Mortar and Vert/DPE, but it also tells me that there's still about 25 to maybe upwards of 30% of Trizu decks that are not using the DPE engine at all, which I've kind of been considering a little bit lately. Maybe trying a variant that does not use the DPE engine, because it is entirely possible that maybe just having the Race Vulgar and Extra Zodiac Exceed are better than having DPE in the extra deck, right? Because not having the DPE, obviously that's a bit of a loss in terms of your options, but at the same time, then those extra deck spots aren't hindering your, quote-unquote main game plan. You can go for 6 material Zeus's more easily. You can go for Appaloosa in general more easily and not have to worry about, sacrificing certain lines of play. But at the same time, I really just think DPE is so good in a vacuum. Well, that's the other thing too, right? For similar reasons to what I mentioned with Appaloosa and Race Vulgar, the quote-unquote pure, not pure, I don't want to call them that, the Trizu builds without DPE tend to match up a little bit better against Soul Tenyi than the ones that do have DPE. But then I feel like the rest of the format, your matchups get very, very slightly worse. Very, very slightly. Not really that noticeable at all. I don't know. It's interesting thinking about DPE in this deck, because it seems like such a no-brainer inclusion. And for a while, I thought it was. But yeah, seeing these trends kind of has made me reflect a little bit more about, and not only just that, but also playing against quite a few Trizu decks that weren't using DPE, or at the very least were using all of their old stuff, maybe in addition to, I don't know. But it's definitely food for thought, for sure, as to whether or not, maybe DPE is not the best option for Trizu. Maybe Trizu is better without DPE. It's you always want to question things like that, even things that seem obvious, because you never know, it could end up being the right answer. That's kind of a life thing too, not just a Yu-Gi-Oh thing. But yeah, so if we look at the main deck and look at the trends there, interesting that Rescue Cat is a downward trend, but I'm pretty sure the last couple of times I've looked, it's just still stayed around 18%, which makes sense to me. Again, I said it before. Every time I talked about Rescue Cat and Trizu, I'll say it again. I don't think Rescue Cat is a bad card in Trizu. I just don't think it's particularly great. Just because of the commitments it requires, the normal summon. I mean, that's pretty much the only commitment. But now, there are really cool plays you can do with Trizu with Rescue Cat, especially if you throw in some other kind of lesser known level 2 beasts. I saw one build using the Fabled Cerebrial, I think it is, the level 2 beast Fable Tuner. It's definitely not a bad option. Well, I mean, it's not. You could try it, but it's going to be a little bit bricky too. Just know that you're just putting more garnets. It's kind of like what I talked about in the deck building video, putting more garnets in just to do some fancier combos. It's I mean, you can do it. It's definitely cute, but is it good? I don't know about that. Let's see here. What else do we have? Upward trend in Valor makes sense because we're seeing, more measures taken against Swordsoul Trizu. Downward trend in Droplet. I think that pretty much makes sense, given that obviously we're not seeing as much Drytron, although I just still think this card is really good, and can definitely be used to counter Swordsoul Tenyi going second, to break their like Chi Shao plus Baron plus whatever else they may have on board. And Trizue is one of those decks that can actually spare the resources to hit multiple things with Droplet and not be too sad about it as far as the advantage that we're losing out on. And then let's see, looks like some minor variants in the Zodiacs that are played. Whiptail's seeing a downward trend. Catarist's actually seeing more play, which is interesting. I'm still in the camp, I think, of Whiptail. I still think Catarist is, I don't know. Maybe it is actually worth it just to try to make that matchup a little better. But it's so specific, right? It's like, it specifically protects your Zodiacs from, like, Chi Shao. Which I guess I'm just trying to figure out how worth it that is over Whiptail's Banish effect. It might be worth, who knows. I don't know, Whiptail's Banish effect is so good. I've even used it recently too. It's just like, it's when it hits, it hits. But I mean, you can make that argument with Catarist as well. But overall, just seeing an increase of play of the number of Zodiacs probably has to do with the downward trend of Rescue Cat, if I do imagine. Looks like we're also seeing a downward trend in Psyframe gears, and obviously Psyframe driver as well as a result. Interesting too, Harpy's Feather Duster and Lightning Storm here, in addition to Swordsoul Tenyi, other decks that we'll go over here in a bit. Less decks seem to be playing those, which is interesting because I feel like Eldlich is, I wouldn't say at an all-time high, but definitely seeing an uptick in popularity, especially I have to imagine among like the other diamond ranks or like platinum. Just people who are still laddering in general. I have to imagine a lot of them are turning to Virtual World. Probably the Zombie World variant because, you know, it's so good against Trizue and Swordsoul is caring about their types that... Yeah, I don't know, it's just interesting to see that in a meta where I expect to see more Eldlich, we're seeing less back row removal. But that could be a reason why more Eldlich are experiencing better results than normal, is maybe because we're playing less back row hate. I mean, there's already less back row hate in general in the format because Swordsoul Tenyi typically does not play Feather Duster or Lightning Storm at all. And then now we're seeing a downward trend for those cards here in Trizue, so maybe that is how Eldlich is kind of able to sort of thrive right now. Speaking of Eldlich, just go ahead and pop over to our next breakdown here, the Zombie World Eldlich variant. So, yeah, we're seeing a few differences here in the trends. Like, for example, I'm noticing Glow Bloom seeing a lot more play. It's pretty good for, you know, searching out the Baldorak here, which is a very, very scary card. I think this card is way scarier than the Golden Lord himself. I've definitely been wrecked by this card more than once while playing against this deck, and yeah, not that fun. Let's see, I'm just looking here at the trends. It looks like it's becoming a little bit more focused on like the zombie / 60 card variants, as we're seeing. Yeah, look at this, 81% of builds playing grass, like 81% of these are 60 card builds, and we're seeing more like reasonings that make sense as a result. Same with Unizombie. Just more like combo-y pieces in general. It's like Solemn Judgment seeing more play, Strike as well, as opposed to like Floodgates like Skill Drain. That's kind of interesting. Prosperity, makes sense. That's going on the decline if grass is on the, you know, uptick. Super Poly, that's an interesting one. Although we look at all the fusions, they're all seeing a decrease in play as well, so that's probably why that's the case. Still, though, the ability to steal any of the opponent's monsters while Zombie World is out for this Nether Soul. I mean, I guess that's why 70% of builds are still playing, but I just would think I would see more than that. It seems like a really good interaction. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, I mean, other than that, it looks like this deck has not really changed a whole lot again, and that it tends to be going in more of a 60-card direction, it seems. Again, 81% is definitely more than I would have guessed, as far as how many Zombie World Eldlich decks out there are actually playing grass is greener, so that is interesting to look at and think about. Look at the extra deck here. You know, we're just seeing downward trends in all the fusions, so that's probably a result of Super Poly seeing less play, or maybe vice versa. Maybe more people just want to fit in excuse me, more extra deck cards, as we're playing more of like a 60 card deck that might have some like slight comboing potential. Like I noticed this Evandred Savior here. Oh, that's to set up zombies, sending them from deck to graveyard. Interesting, okay. Like Gustav Max. I don't know, the trends of Eldlich's extra deck are always kind of weird because Eldlich doesn't really go into the extra deck all that much, so. Okay, I don't know that I really have anything else to say about Eldlich here, other than that I would definitely still expect to see more of it in the format. Again, Zombie World variant, especially as Zombie World tends to just be really good against, really good against Trizu and pretty good against Sword Souls. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's about all I've got to say there. Let's go ahead and move on now to Virtual World. So, for those of you who watched my video about deck building, you have already seen this pretty much exact breakdown. Actually, it is definitely the exact breakdown because I just recorded that video a little while ago. Yeah, no, we are definitely seeing an uptick in Crossout and Nibiru. Definitely makes sense in this format, as you know, Nibiru is really good against pretty much all the meta decks right now. It's even not like as bad as it used to be against Eldlich, now that Eldlich is playing more 60 card variants and summoning more things from their extra deck and summoning like Baldarox in general. It's still pretty rare to get a Nibiru off against them, but it's definitely less rare, I've noticed. But that's also just my own personal bias. It could easily be that as well. The extra deck seems to be where the most amount of flux is. We're seeing downward ticks of play of the Crystal Wing Ultimized Zolkin package. And then we're seeing more of an increase of play of like, you know, like the Ptolemy and the Break Sword. And I think I imagine the Fan as well maybe it wasn't played quite this much before these started seeing a decline in play, but yeah, I don't know. The Zolkin Crystal Wing thing is interesting because obviously Crystal Wing's effect is really powerful. You know, destruction negation that also makes a big monster even bigger. That said, though, it does feel like a little bit unnecessary maybe in this deck. Because in order to get it out, you have to go into Zolkin. In order to get Zolkin out, you have to have two big monsters, which is, it's not hard to have two level 6 monsters on board. But that is often going to keep you from going into like VFD. Well, not often, I don't know, it just kind of depends, but can very easily keep you from going into VFD, which I don't know, if you're going to go into one of these things, you pretty much always rather want to go into VFD or True King of All Calamities. Not only that, but also, you know, I've touched on this a few times, but especially in the Virtual World videos, as well as the, you know, deck building 101 video I did, is that, you know, when I'm first building a deck, I tend to leave out the more expensive or ultra rare, like, fringe options, and really just try to play, like, the most base build to get a good feel of it, and then we go into, like, tech stuff and start worrying about that. We're also seeing an increase of play of Psy-frames. Again, I alluded to this in that last video where I showed you how I built Virtual World, but I imagine that the increase of this card seeing play is correlated to the increase of this card seeing play and the decrease of Imperm seeing play, as Psy-frame tends to hurt Virtual World a lot more than Imperm does. So if you're going to be playing Crossouts, which most people are, you'd probably want to take out the Imperms for Psy-frames, which would hurt you more and are also pretty good. And at the very least, that's what I've done with my build. That's kind of the way I interpreted these statistics here. Interesting that Feather Duster is also seeing a downward tick of play again, just given that Eldlich is so popular right now. But again, Eldlich is probably popular because less decks are playing back row wipes. So who knows? I imagine if Eldlich continues to do as well as it does, we'll probably see this little red arrow turn into a green one sooner rather than later. Okay, I don't know that I have much else really to say about good old Virtual World here, so last deck I'll go over real briefly is Sky Striker, because even though it's not listed on Master Duel Meta's tier list, which again is more indicative of like tournaments, well, not more indicative, it is just representative of tournaments as opposed to ladder, but on ladder, I do think that this deck Sky Striker is quite good. I think it is a pretty solid tier 2 deck. I don't even think it's like tier 2 bordering on tier 3 like a lot of those other decks I mentioned. No, I think Sky Striker is just a pretty good tier 2 deck that deserves coverage as well. So, interesting that we're seeing a slight decline of play of the DPE engine overall. I mean, it's still at around 94%, 93. We'll even it out because there's some 92s here as well, but 93% of builds are still playing the DPE engine, which sounds about right to me, but I guess it must have probably just been a couple of... That's the other thing about the deck breakdowns in Master Duel meta in general. Like, if even a couple lists have recently done well that don't, like, that omit, you know, an engine like this, it results in this downward trend, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, DPE is not optimal right now. It just means that, like, you know, somebody's been doing well with a build that doesn't use DPE. But that said, if you don't have DPE but you do have Sky Strikers, it's not necessary. This is extremely helpful. Let's see, looks like we're also seeing a downward trend of play of Ghost Bell. That kind of doesn't surprise me. I have noticed that Ghost Bell has kind of been falling off for me personally a little bit lately. I just don't think... I think what it is like, less decks are playing DPE now than, you know, even a couple of weeks ago. Because I think at the start, everybody just jammed DPE into their deck, but there are some decks that DPE doesn't necessarily go into. Either that, or maybe people were just getting sick of playing DPE, so they moved to decks that don't use it at all. And then there's also the prevalence of Soul Tenyi, which again typically does not use DPE. So that's probably why Bell is falling a little bit in popularity. I don't think Bell is a bad card by any means, and I'll definitely still play her in my Sky Striker deck, which I'm pretty sure I am, right? Yeah, I'm very sure I am. And any other deck I can find room for her, but I can understand the potential decrease in play. Pankratops, I've been thinking about crafting one of these for my Sky Striker deck. It's a really good card for decks like this. Maybe. It's a decided maybe. Definitely not necessary, but the effect is pretty powerful. And it's also a good way to, like, put down a threat during your opponent's turn, and then if your opponent doesn't deal with it, but like sets a monster or something, then you can just tribute itself, and or it's any card even. So yeah, if your opponent just plays a card on the field in general, you can sack itself to get it out of the main monster zone, and then you can start using your Sky Striker stuff. So yeah, that's pretty nice there. Increased play of Imperm makes sense, as it's pretty good against Swordsoul. Interesting that this deck of all decks is an increased play of Feather Duster. I imagine that is to counter Eldlich, because even though Sky Striker is a control deck itself, it does get hurt by a lot of the stun decks locks, like Vanity's Emptiness or even Skill Drain. So I can see wanting the extra, or more people wanting the Feather Duster. Where is the Feather Duster? Droplet, that's an interesting one. I've never really considered Droplet in my Sky Striker deck, but 60% of builds play at least one copy. That's kind of interesting. I guess you don't usually end up with that many extra cards, though. I don't... Oh, you know what, though? It is a good way to get monsters out of your main monster zone to then play Sky Striker spells. That's a decent reason to want to play Droplet, I suppose. Okay, yeah, I could see that. I could definitely see that. Oh, let's see what other trends we have here. Prosperity, seeing an upward trend. That's good. I think this card is pretty good in this deck. Imperm we talked about. Yeah, I think that's just about everything here. Okay, let's go ahead and take another look at the tier list as we prepare to end off this video. So, yeah, I hope you guys found this metagame analysis helpful. I really like doing these kinds of videos where it's not just, you know, endless gameplay, but we actually get to talk about the game in a broader sense. Yeah, like I said, I'm just always down for videos like this. I like doing them quite a bit. So, if you guys like watching them, then I will continue to make them. Duh, statement of the year, but yeah, I think that's about all I've got for this one. So guys, thank you so much for watching, especially the very end like this. I greatly appreciate it. If you feel so inclined, I would also be appreciative if you feel like commenting or subscribing. Comments, I love to get feedback, especially on videos like this that are less straightforward than the, you know, gameplay or deck profile videos. Just what your thoughts are, like about the meta, about the structure of the video, about, you know, other videos like it you want to see, changes to the video style you'd like to see, anything in general. I'm always open to feedback, and you guys are really good about giving solid, constructive criticism. So we definitely love to see that. And yeah, subscribing is a great way to support the channel, as well as stay up to date of the videos that are coming out, which if you subscribe, you can look forward to daily videos. I put out a Master Duel video every single day. So, yeah, that's about all I've got for this one. Without further ado, this is Hexlex, signing out. Hope you guys have a fantastic day.